Welcome back to our course. Today we'll be talking about theory in environmental ethics. I'll be talking about this piece that has this title by Gudorf and Hutchinson, and I'm going to work through many centuries of moral theory in a relatively short time. So I hope you enjoy and make a note of any questions you have, and you can use this video as a guide to the reading to go back and look more in depth at the reading. We're not going to cover everything in the reading, but for some sections I'm going to go offer a little bit more than what the reading provides. So ask questions if you have them, and I hope you enjoy. So first we'll start out with an introduction to moral theory, and then I'll be talking about utilitarianism and deontology, two classical moral theories, and then we'll see how those theories have been extended within environmental ethics, and we'll talk about biocentrism, ecocentrism, deep ecology, and finish off by talking about pragmatism in environmental ethics. So, to begin with, what is ethics? Ethics is about how we make choices in our everyday lives. It's about small scale choices that we make on a day-to-day basis about our relationships and our partners and our studies and our career goals, and also larger scale choices that we make together collectively about what kind of society we want to have, and how we build our lives together and what kind of world we want to build. So I use the term ethics interchangeably with morality, and it includes, like I said, big questions like what's the best form of government, and also smaller scale questions like what should I have for dinner. Maybe you can think of how the question of what you have for dinner is an ethical question. What are the ethical considerations that go along with that? Here's a whole list of other ethical questions that constitute what's called applied ethics. So, do I have to go to my brother's wedding? What's the best kind of life? That might be less of an applied ethical question than a broader ethical question. Who should I consider a role model? Should I let my kids choose their friends? Should I tell my 3-year-old about the fires in Maui? Should trans youth receive gender transition care? These are all applied questions about what choice we should actually make. When we talk about moral theory or ethical theory, we're talking about broader, more abstract questions about the nature of these kinds of questions. So we're asking, what are we actually doing when we are asking these sorts of applied questions? What are we asking about? What does it mean that I should or should not get an abortion, or that we should limit a corporation's environmental impact? What does that mean that we ought to do it? And so that's what moral theorists want to know. What does it mean when we use these terms to have discussions about morality, and is there some kind of objective fact out there about how to live? So ethics concerns how to live. Moral theory wants to know, are there objective moral facts? And if so, what makes it the case that the facts are what they are? So Anthony Weston says to think or act ethically is to take care for the basic needs and legitimate expectations of others as well as our own. So ethics is as much about how we treat others as it is about how we treat ourselves. One of the questions on the slide of questions is, is it okay to poison my body with alcohol? So that's a moral question as much as any question about how much charity we should give or anything concerning others. So we have ethical obligations and expectations of ourselves and how we treat ourselves and others. And so a lot of what we're doing is asking what expectations are legitimate of ourselves and others, and what needs are basic that ought to be met. So ethics is about you, the choices you make, the kind of person you want to become, and how you relate to yourself and the world around you. And it's about us, how we live together, and what kind of world we want to build together. Ethical claims are prescriptive. They don't just tell us how the world is. They don't just describe the world like science purports to. They also tell us what to do. They have a kind of evaluation embedded in them. Some people say they point towards doing certain things or point away from doing other things. Classical ethical theories, the authors claim, are anthropocentric. They center humans first and foremost. They're about how we want to build human societies and take care of other human beings. Environmental ethics seeks to expand the sphere of moral consideration. So it stands on the frontier. It's kind of pushing the limits of moral theory further and further and further into what we consider worthy of our moral attention. So we'll start with utilitarianism as the first theory we're going to look at. So utilitarians think that actions that have the best overall consequences or maximum benefit are right, and those that don't are wrong. It says, always seek to bring about the greatest good for the greatest number of those impacted by the actions. We're trying to maximize the good with utilitarianism and thinking about the consequences of our actions and what's going to result. And the author says that utilitarianism just says, do the thing as long as something's going to lead to more benefit than harm, then it's the right thing to do. But that leaves out this idea of maximizing the good. So it's not just about bringing about more good than bad. It's about maximizing the amount of good that we can bring about with any of our actions. So the hedonist, which is one kind of utilitarian, identifies goodness with pleasure. So here I've written, pleasure is the only thing that's intrinsically valuable. That means it's good in itself. We seek it just for the thing it is, and not just for what it can get us, which is called extrinsically valuable. So extrinsically valuable things are valuable for the sake of something else. Like going to the dentist, don't like that in itself, but I still go because it's extrinsically valuable. It will lead to me having less pain in the future, to having a healthier mouth, which is really important, to having a healthy overall life. So that's why I go to the dentist, because even though I don't like going there and having people stick their fingers in my mouth, I know that it's important for my future well-being, for my future, the health of my teeth in the future, that I go to the dentist regularly and get my teeth cleaned to make my life overall more pleasurable, ultimately. But pleasure, we don't have to ask, well, why do I want my life to be more pleasurable, or why am I seeking pleasure? That seems to be for its own good. We seek that for its own sake. We want to be happy and to feel pleasure just because of the kind sort of emotion that it is, or the sort of experience that it is. So we don't have to say, well, I want to be happy to get to something else. So that's why we're saying pleasure is intrinsically valuable. Now, hedonist utilitarians believe that pleasure is the only thing that's good in itself, and since we're maximizing the good, we should try to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. So that's one version of utilitarianism. Classical utilitarianism is said by these authors to be anthropocentric, in that even though it makes room for sentient non-humans to have moral standing, the utilitarians' focus was traditionally on making life better for people. So utilitarians were focused on enhancing human societies, but the theory says that we need to maximize pleasure over pain, and lots of non-humans are capable of experiencing pleasure and pain. So more recently, utilitarians have emphasized that everyone counts in utilitarianism, even non-humans, even other species. If the experience of the pleasure is the same in a human and a non-human, then that experience counts as having equal value within the utilitarian framework. Okay, so actions are right. We're moving on to deontology now, a sort of contender with utilitarianism. And these two are often presented sort of the main main contenders in moral theory. So deontology says actions are right or wrong if they conform to some absolute, universal, and unconditional standard, or fail to conform to it. So they're right if they conform to that standard, and they're wrong if they don't. So it's not about the consequences. It's not about whether something will bring pleasure or pain. Deontology says that some things are just right or wrong, period. It doesn't matter how much pleasure results. So if we're taking something like lying, the utilitarian's going to say, if it makes people happier, if it makes everyone happier, it's fine to tell a lie, as long as the outcome is better than not telling the lie. And for Kant, it's always wrong to tell a lie, no matter what. Even if an axe murderer, is chasing your friend who's hiding in your basement, you should still tell the truth, because it's always wrong to lie. So Kant thinks that what determines if something's right is the categorical imperative. This is like a holy rule that he thinks all rational individuals are subject to just because we're rational. So, written this way, it says, act so that the maximum of your action could be willed a universal law. What does that mean? It means act according to principles it's possible for everyone to follow. So you take your action, like, should I keep my promise? Your action might be breaking your promise, or you're considering breaking your promise because it's convenient. So that could be the principle. Break your promise whenever it's convenient. And then you think, you try to figure out if that's a rule that every single person could follow. So if it's something that everyone could do, then it's okay to do it. And if it's something that everyone could not do, then it's not okay to do it. So think again about breaking your promise whenever it's convenient. Kant thought that breaking your promises is always prohibited, because if everybody broke their promises when they felt like it, then we wouldn't be able to make promises anymore, because no one would take anyone seriously when they said, I promise. It wouldn't have any force behind it or any meaning if everyone just broke their promises whenever they feel like it. So he thinks that that's why you ought to keep your promise, because it conforms to a rule that everyone has to follow, basically. If people didn't follow that rule, we wouldn't be able to make promises anymore. Another way he put the categorical imperative is always treat humanity, whether you're in yourself or others, always as an end and never merely as a means. What that means is that you have to respect people for the full, autonomous, rational individuals that they are. To treat somebody as a means means just to use them for what they can get you. And note here that he says never merely as a means. So what he's saying is that we can't just use somebody for what they can get us if at the same time we're not also recognizing their humanity and their personhood. So it's okay to use your barista to get you your coffee and use your bus driver to get where you're going on the bus, but you have to always at the same time recognize that that's a full human being with their own reasons for existing, their own rational mind, and you have to respect them as an end in themselves. That's what that means, is that you're not just using them for what they can get you. So why? Why did Kant think that this was the rule that always applied? He thought this is a categorical imperative, which means it applies always no matter what. You can contrast that with a hypothetical imperative, which just applies in certain hypothetical circumstances. Like if you want to get a degree, you should go to college. It's not categorical to go to college. It's just hypothetical. If you want this, if you have this goal, then you should do this. But the categorical imperative is independent of what your goals are. You should always act in this way. That is, according to principles that everyone could follow. Why? Because we're free and rational, okay? Because we're autonomous, that means we're able, instead of just acting on our instincts, instead of just doing whatever we feel like, we can pause and we can ask, what ought I to do in this situation? What am I obligated to do? Or what's my duty? What should I do? And to ask that question is to take up a universal perspective. It's to put your own feelings and inclinations aside and to say, what should somebody in this situation, in my shoes, what should they do in this situation? And to do that is to take up a kind of universal perspective. And so you're automatically, in virtue of your rationality of being able to ask that question, what should I do? You're subjecting yourself to a law that applies to everyone. Okay. But you can't make noise. Still. Talking to my 4-year-old over there, who's not an autonomous, rational individual, which is why Kant didn't think that kids counted as ends in themselves, like fully rational adults, even though they're a special case because they're going to become that later. Okay, so it's because we're rational and autonomous, and that's what makes us human. Humans are the only species that have that feature. Because we have that trait, and that's what defines us as human beings, we're subject to the categorical imperative. We're subject to considering whether other people could behave in the ways that we're behaving. And if we think that we can behave differently than everyone else can behave, that we're allowed, or that we ought to do something that's unique to us that doesn't apply to every other rational person, we're making an exception for ourselves, and that Kant thought is irrational. So you can see this like in the case of the second formulation of the categorical imperative, when I said always treat humanity as an end and never merely as a means. If you think that you deserve respect and you're autonomous and rational, and that's partly why you deserve respect, but that someone else who's also autonomous, free and rational, who does not deserve respect, then you're making an exception for yourself, and that's not rational. So for Kant, morality is all about reason, the ability to think about your reasons for acting and what you're obligated to do. All right, deontology is absolutely anthropocentric. Rationality is what makes us moral beings. It's what gives us moral standing. It's what means that it's what makes it the case that people have to respect us as ends in ourselves, and adult humans are the only rational beings. So anthropocentric just means it puts humans above everything else. And for Kant, that's no question. Humans are like divine. All right, so anthropocentrism can accommodate a concern about the environment. So we can think about the environment from a purely human perspective, right? From just thinking about how our treatment of the environment impacts humans. And even that would give us reason to make a lot of changes in how we relate to nature and how we treat the world around us, because right now we're about to make ourselves extinct. And so if we want to preserve humanity, if we want to keep the planet livable for humans, if we want to not be miserable in 120-degree weather for weeks on end, and lose our homes to fires and floods and all those things that are happening because of our treatment of the environment, if humans were the only thing that we care about, then we can absolutely advocate for more concern for the environment, for its extrinsic value, for how it impacts humans. We have to have clean air and water for humans to flourish. That's an anthropocentric reason to care about the environment. But what environmental ethics has done is tried to extend our concern. What is our ultimate aim? Well, environmental ethics often sees anthropocentrism as a kind of problematic framework, and many environmental ethicists think that we need to expand that framework to accommodate more. So on these anthropocentric perspectives, utilitarianism and Kantianism or deontology, the environment itself is only valuable extrinsically insofar as it impacts humans. But biocentrism is the first step to taking those frameworks and extending that sphere of moral concern, that sort of the horizon of what we're paying attention to as having moral value, as being someone that we ought to care about in its own respect, for its own sake, to recognize more than humans as possessing that inherent value. So creatures that aren't humans, and even some environmental ethicists are going to say trees and ecosystems and rivers, and different theories are going to stop at a different point along that expansion of moral concern. Okay, so Singer takes utilitarianism and emphasizes that non-humans are not the only sentient creatures. We're not the only ones who are capable of suffering and pleasure. And because non-human animals can also suffer and feel pleasure, we ought to care about them directly for themselves, and not just for how caring about them is going to impact us, which it also is. He reminds us that Bentham, one of the original people who articulated utilitarian perspectives, wrote, the question is not can they reason or can they talk, but can they suffer? So when we're thinking about how to treat other beings, it's not just about whether they are rational, it's a question of whether they can experience. And if they can experience, then that experience has value in itself, and to the extent that it's like our own experiences, it has the same value as our experiences. And so that's sort of the basis for expanding beyond anthropocentrism for Singer. He says, like interests deserve equal consideration. Well, it's not just interests that deserve equal consideration, but it's a main tenet of ethics that similar cases ought to be judged similarly. So if two things are alike, we ought to have the same moral judgment about them. And to think that we're special, that humans' interests are special just because of our species, just because we're humans, just because we're members of that species, and for no other reason, is a kind of speciesism. And Singer compares that with sexism and racism and says we're not allowed to just assume that we're better for no other reason than the fact that we're of this species. He says medical experimentation on a chimpanzee must be defended in exactly the same way it would be if a human with equal capacities were substituted for the chimpanzee. Pain is pain, whether it's inflicted on a chimp or a human infant, and he talks about how chimpanzees are far more, their mental capacities are more developed than human infants and even some toddlers. There's some age around there where you get to be capable of reasoning or cognizant as a chimp, but it's not as a newborn. And so he says, if we're going to do these really torturous things to chimps, which we do, then we should be able to do them to infants too. Or really, he's saying, if we're not going to be willing to do these to infants because it would be monstrous and inhumane, keep that word in mind, right? I mean, we use that to just mean sort of conscientious or sensitive, empathetic to other people's suffering. But he says we shouldn't just be empathetic to other people's suffering. We should take seriously any suffering that's as great as that, even if it's in another species. So for Singer, all sentient beings are worthy of equal consideration, which does not mean that all sentient beings are worthy of equal treatment. So he emphasizes that it doesn't mean that pigs should have the right to vote, for instance, or that young pigs need access to an education, right? Just because human children do. Different beings are different, but their interest ought to be taken into account equally, and they have an equal interest in not suffering, at least when that suffering is compared to identical suffering in a human. Those interests are equal, and we ought to consider them equally. Species membership by itself doesn't make a difference to how valuable something is, even if mental capacities and the capacity for suffering absolutely do make a difference to how valuable something is. So the authors raise some problems with Singer's utilitarianism, what they consider problems. The first one is, how do we adjudicate between species when their interests are the same? So is there any reason to prefer a human if we have to decide between a human and a non-human and the suffering is exactly the same? Well, Singer's going to say, how do we distinguish between two people when their suffering is the same? Does the fact that some people are racists make their theory any better because it gives them a way to distinguish between people of different races? He might say at some point we just have to kind of toss up our hands and say there's no better outcome here because both outcomes have the same interests involved or impact different beings' interests in the same way, so one is not better than the other. The authors raise that as a problem. Vanderveer says look to their psychological capacity, that if something's more developed psychologically, then it's worse for them to suffer. But Singer's going to say if the suffering is the same, then even their psychological capacity isn't relevant unless their psychological capacity makes that suffering worse, which it very well may. I mean, Singer has this example of performing experiments on people or animals kidnapped from parks at random. And he says, if you're doing that to humans, that's going to cause a lot more suffering because it's going to enter our psyche in a way that doing that to squirrels is not. They're not going to be thinking about being kidnapped if that's happening a lot, but people absolutely would. So psychological capacity can make a difference to the nature of someone's suffering. But Singer is going to say in cases where it doesn't make a difference, where the suffering from the inside is experienced in the same way, the suffering is equally bad. And the authors say that a problem with Singer's view is that it excludes non-sentient life forms from equal consideration. Beings who aren't sentient, trees, I'm looking at my fence full of Virginia creeper, All of these things are not considered ends in themselves. They're not considered things that we have to look out for directly. It's not bad to harm them just because of what they are, what they're like. There's no reason not to destroy them unless there's somebody with experiences that is affected by that. So you can think about how Singer might respond. I think Singer's okay with that. So he's going to say, what reason is there if there's nothing to experience it? What kind of reason could there be not to destroy a tree if nothing will experience that? So that's where environmental ethics is going to go beyond traditional utilitarianism in the theories we're going to look at after this one. All right, so we see how Singer emphasizes that utilitarianism can be extended beyond humans, beyond anthropocentrism. Well, Tom Regan is going to take deontology, or Kantianism. It's called Kantianism because it comes from Immanuel Kant, a famous philosopher who defended deontology. So he extended that view to include any subject of a life. So remember, Kant was focused on who's rational and autonomous, but Regan is going to say it's not about rationality or autonomy, it's about anyone who has a complex emotional and perceptual life. So that's what it means to be a subject of a life for him. And anyone who's a subject of a life has inherent moral value and ought to be treated as an end and not just as a means. So it's not just humanity anymore. They're taking that same basic framework and extending it beyond people to include any creature that has a rich kind of experience of having a life. All right, and the authors say, well, Regan's attempt to move beyond autonomy and use the same kind of deontological framework to include any creatures who are the subjects of a life, they say this view, this extension of deontology, has parallel problems to Singer's problems. So the first one being, how do we adjudicate between species when both are subjects of a life? If you have two creatures who are both subjects of a life, how do you know which one is more valuable? Or if we have to save one, most of us would think if there's a house burning and inside there's a cat and a toddler, you should save the toddler. So how do we, does this theory have that result? And if not, that seems to be a problem for it. 2, it excludes non-sentient life forms from possessing inherent value. Again, so it's saying that because Virginia Creeper is not the subject of a life, it doesn't have any kind of experience or complex emotional and perceptual life. Virginia Creeper doesn't perceive anything. It doesn't have emotions. It doesn't feel anything. It doesn't feel pain, even rudimentary kinds of pain. Because it doesn't have that, it's not wrong to destroy it for its own sake, even though destroying it might make someone upset. And the authors are saying that's a problem, though the defenders of these theories are going to say it's not really a problem. It doesn't matter if you destroy Virginia Creeper if you don't want it growing on your fence. It's not like bad for the creeper. It hasn't impacted their experience in any way, so there's no sense in which it's a problem for the Virginia Creeper, though it might be a problem for people or it might be a problem for the creatures who hide in there. That's all fine with these theories, but the Virginia Creeper in itself does not have inherent moral worth on these views. And the authors are saying that's a problem with these attempts to extend anthropocentrism. Okay, so one more attempt is that Paul Taylor takes the sphere of moral concern, again, sort of the horizon of what we're paying attention to as an end in itself, beyond sentience and beyond being a subject of a life, to include any teleological center of a life. So what does teleological mean? Well, it comes from this word telos, which means having a purpose or a goal. And this is from Aristotle, who talks about this a lot. So what is the purpose or goal of a human? Well, Aristotle characterizes it as this kind of human excellence or human flourishing. It's kind of becoming the best you can be. You can think of a flower blooming. It's kind of becoming your full self and the best person you can be, and something that you achieve through practice, living your life and encountering difficulties and challenges, you get better at being a person, at embodying virtues that lead you to be maximally fulfilled, which is not the same as happy. Not just an experience, it's how you are in your life overall. So telos is our inner striving. One second. If you want to keep doing that, you have to put the headphones in. Or turn the volume way down. What? Your stomach hurts? Okay. I think it'll feel better soon. Probably means you have to go to the bathroom. All right, so telos is our inner striving. Speaking of going to the bathroom. For humans, this is a type of flourishing or becoming the best versions of ourselves. For a microbe, it's a kind of microbial flourishing. It's them sort of fulfilling themselves, being the best kind of microbes they can be, not sort of withering and dying away, but the opposite of that. For a tree, it's the same. You can think of a tree like in full bloom, full healthy, flourishing tree or a flower, maximizing one's well-being. So consciousness and sentience are not required for one to have a well-being or a telos that is to be capable of thriving. So you can think of a tree thriving, a plant. My kale definitely did not thrive over the summer because I didn't water it. But if I had watered it in past seasons, it's been big and beautiful and just producing so much, right? That's a kind of thriving. It's not about the experience of the kale. It's a way to think about flourishing. I know. All right.
I'm hungry.
Okay, you can eat. All right. Every teleological center of a life has a good of its own. So everything that has that kind of inner striving or purpose, the way a plant has that sense of fulfillment or flourishing, can be well off or not, right? It has a good of its own in the sense that it can be better or worse off. And that's what makes them objectively valuable or valuable independently of whether anyone cares about them. Because they have a good of their own, because they can be well off or not, that being well off or flourishing or thriving does not depend on how much anyone cares about them. I mean, it might be impacted by how much we care. If I don't care about the kale in my garden, which I didn't very much this summer, and just let it wither and die, then that will impact its well-being. But it can thrive with or without me, theoretically. Okay, so again, the authors raise two problems. You might be able to anticipate them by now. For Taylor, this idea of a teleological center of a life being what's inherently valuable. One is that it can't resolve conflicts between individuals with a telos. It excludes entities that are not teleological centers, such as rivers, mountains, or ecosystems. Okay, so it's the same two problems, is that we can't say, well, if kale has as a center of a life and I have my own center of a life, then why should my flourishing be considered more valuable than the kale? So this is being raised as an objection to Taylor to say, it's obvious that humans are more important than kale. So but your theory doesn't have that result, and so it's a bad theory. And it excludes anything that's not a teleological center, such as rivers, mountains, or ecosystems. So this question is going to be addressed in a moment later on, but I ask you, do you think it's correct that rivers, mountains, and ecosystems are not teleological centers? Or could we think of a river or a mountain or an ecosystem, a jungle or forest? Can those things also flourish or not? And can we think of some way in which they have a good of their own? Somebody we're going to get to is going to say, yes, they have a good of their own too. But Taylor doesn't see it that way, according to these authors, and they're raising that as a problem for him. All right. So biocentrism involves taking some criterion of moral standing, like some feature that gives someone, that makes someone a moral, what's called a moral patient. That's something we ought to care about directly. So biocentrists are each taking some feature, and they differ on which feature that is, but they're saying this is the group of beings that we ought to care about directly because they have this feature. And we ought not to care about anything else directly because it doesn't have this feature. And with each theory we looked at, that got kind of enlarged each time. Gifford and Hutchinson, I hope I'm pronouncing their names correctly, argue that in order to be true to its name, to be an environmental ethic for real, we have to provide principles that justify extending our moral sensibilities to that larger world, to the larger ecosystems that we're a part of. That's an assumption. So I'm not sure if I share that assumption. I'm not sure if you all share that assumption, but it's a question that you should ask yourselves. Are they right that to be environmentally ethical, like to think as an environmental ethicist, you really have to take the whole world into consideration, the whole environment? Or is it enough that some environmental ethics, could it really be an environmental ethic that says, well, actually ecosystems and rivers are not valuable in themselves, but animals are only, or animals and plants are, or whatever theory you happen to be moved by. So Aldo Leopold expands this notion to say it's not just about having some particular feature and looking at individuals that have that feature as moral patients, but we have to really enlarge the boundaries of the community. Think of the community as not just a collection of individuals, but as all the components that make up an ecosystem, and that ecosystem collectively. So it's not just thinking about which individuals have moral worth and picking some feature that in virtue of which they have moral worth. Instead, we have to think of the land itself, that is like the whole system as a whole, a biotic mechanism, a highly organized whole with its own integrity. So they themselves are unique entities, and we can relate to them. You can love the land, you can love a forest, you can live in a forest and be, in sync with the forest and relate to that as an entity. And we might have duties to the entity itself, the entire whole, and not just the individuals that comprise it. That's why this is called ecocentrism instead of biocentrism. So the biocentric view is expanding those classical theories to include more and more subjects of a life, like Regan said, or more and more individuals as centers of our moral concern, or things that we ought to pay attention to. But the ecocentrist is saying, no, it's not about us having duties or obligations to different individuals. It's actually about how we relate to the entirety of the whole system that we're a part of, the whole environmental or ecological system that we're a part of. And those are entities in themselves, and we ought to treat them as ends in themselves. And so Leopold says, a thing's right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It's wrong when it tends otherwise. And the authors immediately raise a problem and say, well, on this view, it's the ecosystem that's really the main thing we ought to care about. And the individuals within that system, like you and I, are only valuable insofar as we contribute to the integrity of that system. And Callcott extends this idea and develops this idea to say it's because ecosystems are like organisms. They have this kind of holistic complexity, and he says systemic integrity. So we can think of that as a system that itself can be well off or not, and we can consider it healthy or not by monitoring vital signs, identifying risk factors. So something like a mass extinction is going to be bad for the health of the ecosystem, not just bad for the individuals who die. And so it's an analogy. Whatever you want. You can do it. Get whatever you want. There's cheese. grapes, lots of things to eat.
Why can't I eat my volleyball?
Because I'm busy.
Okay.
Okay. Cheese and grapes.
Where did it say
Right.
that?
Because now I'm mixed up. Do you want to say hi? Come here.
Where did
It doesn't look interesting. It's just words. Do you want to tell them your name?
Little knifey.
This is Little Knifey. All right. All right. So it's because the ecosystem as a whole has its own integrity.
I
Could be
made a video on
better
the
or
parrot.
worse off. Great. That we ought to care about it for its own sake, and we can think of them by analogy to organisms. So within my body, there are all kinds of different organs playing a role. My heart is beating, my brain is telling my heart to beat, it's telling my lungs to breathe, and I'm breathing, and my muscles are all working together, and I'm moving my hands to make this lecture. Everything's working together in this complex whole. My skin is perspirating when it needs to, and cooling my whole body off when it needs to, and making goosebumps to warm me up when it needs to, and it's all working together, each little piece. And we can think of an ecosystem in the same way, and it has the same sort of functional unified functionality. So we can think of them in the same way. Both can be healthy or ill, the ecosystem as a whole and my body, and that's why we ought to treat whole ecosystems like ends in themselves. Okay, so one more thing they don't go into, I want to just mention, is microbes. So microbes are inside our bodies. We have, I think, something like 5 pounds, up to 5 pounds of microbial cells in our bodies. Microbes are just the microscopic organisms that live inside of us or on our skin that actually participate in our bodily processes. So it's not just really a metaphor, thinking of a human organism as a metaphor for an ecosystem, but when you think about it, we actually are ecosystems. So we think of ourselves as this one thing, this genetically identical every cell within our skin barrier. We're just an individual, but because we have so many microbes in our bodies, we're actually a whole community of individuals just living within this skin barrier, in this spot, standing right where I'm standing. There's millions of different organisms all doing their thing. And so maybe it's not just that we're like ecosystems, or that ecosystems are like individual organisms, but maybe individual organisms actually are ecosystems when we take all of that into account. And that's a field that's just beginning to be really taken seriously and explored. And so I think that maybe ecosystems are not just like organisms, but actually what we think of as organisms are actually collections of organisms. And so it's the same, whether you look at it on the scale, on something like the size of an individual human, where all those organisms are playing their different role in digestion and immunity and all of these things that are necessary for me to live. Those other organisms are part of that, are participating in that system. Or we think of it on the scale of a forest or jungle or even the whole world, right? You can also think of that as a single system where everything is sort of playing its role, and the biomes are filling different roles in the whole, and microbial cells up to huge trees or mushroom, fungal systems that are connected, that are the largest living systems on the planet, or coral, right? We can think of those as just systems at every level. It's fractal, really, like Adrienne Marie Brown says in Emergent Strategy, is that there's resemblance at the large scale down to the smallest scale. And so maybe we should care about ecosystems for the same reason we care about ourselves, because we are also ecosystems. Just a side note. Okay, so Callicott's theory contrasts with Singer's. So Singer says only sentience counts, and Callicott's theory is saying all systems, all living systems comprised of all these little pieces are valuable in themselves. And it contrasts with Regan's, where only subjects of a life count. So Regan is saying only experiencers count. Anything that can have an experience and emotions and a richness of sort of perceiving what's happening to it and perceiving the world around it and experiencing inputs, sensory inputs or other kinds of inputs, those are the only ones that count. Well, Taylor, who said, remember, any teleological center is inherently valuable, Taylor might actually be providing a theory that goes hand in hand with Callicott's, because we may see these ecosystems as teleological centers. And that's what I sort of noted before, is that maybe the authors were wrong, and they're bringing up this point anyway, so they see the complexity of this question, which is that is an ecosystem actually a thing with its own sort of inner thriving or good of its own, or can it be healthy or ill? And so if you think yes, then you might actually think that Callicott's theory and Taylor's theory are really mutually, they just go well together. They fit really nicely together. So, of course, we want to know, is it really reasonable to think that an ecosystem has its own moral standing apart from any of the individual sentient creatures that have experiences that make it up? So I'll leave that to you to think about. And now I want to just go back and, before we get to deep ecology, I'm going to go back through these dozens of slides and just look at this list of what I wanted to make it through, because we're almost to the end now. I'm going to talk about deep ecology and pragmatism. But here's where we've been. So first I did an introduction of what ethics is. It's these day-to-day questions that we ask and what moral theories are trying to do, because now we're looking at moral theories. Utilitarianism, deontology, biocentrism, and ecocentrism. They're not asking these more practical questions like, should we dam this river? But they're asking more abstract, larger scale questions about what makes something right or wrong, or what makes something an appropriate thing to care about morally. And the utilitarian says it's whatever can experience pleasure, or whatever can experience, can be benefited, that's sentient, that can feel better off. The deontologist says, no, some things are right or wrong, and that depends on the categorical imperative, whether the creature is a rational being and how we're treating rational beings, and whether we're acting according to rules that everyone could follow. Then we saw two attempts to expand those two views. So we saw Singer take utilitarianism and talk about the relevance of non-human sentient creatures, that they can also experience pain, so we probably shouldn't dissect them alive or slit their throats when they're alive, so that we can have better tasting food, right, if we're taking everyone's interests seriously. Regan took deontology, Kant's ethics, and tried to extend that to say, well, it's not just about who's rational that we should treat as an end in themselves, but who is the subject of a life, who can have this richness and emotional, experiential richness in their experience, richness of their experience. So Singer expanded utilitarianism and Regan expanded deontology. And then we saw biocentrists and ecocentrists. So biocentrists took that same basic framework, that it's about thinking of individuals, but expanded what counts as an individual that we should care about. And they included, Taylor included, now I have to go back and look at Taylor. Okay, so Taylor included teleology, right? So Taylor was talking not just about experience, but also just having a good of your own. And so Taylor was saying we extend beyond experience to think of anything that can be well off or not, right? Anything that can be better or worse off. It can flourish. And so it's not about, experience, but it's still about which individuals count. For Taylor, trees and plants are also going to count because they can be well off or not. The ecocentrist then took that picture and said, look, it's not about features of individuals, making them moral worthy. Instead, it's about respecting the integrity of the whole picture, the whole system. And so the object of our concern ought to be that whole system and not just the individuals within it, no matter what feature you're looking at. Okay, so biocentrism is saying individuals that are capable of having a good, all those individuals ought to count. And ecocentrism is saying it's not about individuals, it's about considering the integrity of the whole system. And they're criticized for seeing human individuals as valuable only insofar as we are part of that system. Okay, so now deep ecology. So shallow ecology is going to say traditional environmentalism is anthropocentric. Shallow ecology is anthropocentric like traditional environmentalists. They're going to say, look, it's about benefits, it's about humans, and about thinking about costs and benefits. And we need to better protect our air because humans are going to breathe it. And if we don't have clean air, we're not going to be able to live. And at least the quality of our lives are going to be reduced, as they are by all the people not breathing clean air currently because of pollution, wildfires, or whatever else is polluting the air around all of us. So, and this is what is, happening with the election and the current political campaigning of what people are saying they care about, like politicians are saying they care about is making the air clean so people can breathe it, right? Which is important. But it's still taking an existing system and trying to improve life for us within that system. Deep ecology is trying to look for a better system, a better way of thinking about the nature of reality, right? And not just how we can preserve the earth so that more generations of humans can come exist, which is one important goal. Okay, so deep ecology is sort of turning that whole framework on its head, seeing all creatures as equal, as egalitarian in that sense, in the sense of their intrinsic value or their intrinsic worth. And like Leopold, the whole is more important than its parts. So thinking of the whole really ought to be the priority, thinking of the whole system and the flourishing of the earth as a whole. Okay? One question to ask, and this is really building on Leopold, the view. So one question to ask, is deep ecology misanthropic? So misanthropic means you don't like humans, right? Anthropocentric means humans are the best. Misanthropic means humans are the worst. And when we think about the whole, the health of the planet, we absolutely are the worst. I mean, we're making life worse for virtually every single other species on Earth. And virtually every other species on Earth would be better off if we didn't exist. So, and that's with the exception of like cows and chickens and pigs that we created, but who wouldn't exist. And arguably that would be better off, at least the ones we have in factory farms. Non-existence would be better than a life of torture and suffering. But apart from like our pets, basically, who we care about and treat well, and maybe like some other, animals that we think are really awesome, and like dolphins or something, but even the oceans we're destroying. So really it's just our pets, but who are better off because of our presence. But if we weren't here, virtually everyone would be better off. And so the question is, would deep ecology ought deep ecologists to advocate for the extinction of humankind altogether? Like, does it see us as a pathogen? And if you think of the earth as an organism, it's easy with that analogy to compare us to a kind of pathogen or cancer because of how we're multiplying at the expense of everything around us. Maybe deep ecology is misanthropic and we should be against it for that reason, but maybe it's correct for that reason. Or maybe it's just not misanthropic and we're misinterpreting, and we can actually see a future for humankind like Ishmael did, where Daniel Quinn's Ishmael, where we can actually live in a way that doesn't violate the peacekeeping law, and we can make room for evolution to continue beyond us and for the earth to continue to thrive because of our consciousness and our ability to exercise forethought and plan ahead and see what's coming and think about reasons we have for behaving in certain ways rather than just taking what comes and going with the flow and going with our instincts. All right, deep ecology goes further than that, radically further. So classical theories view individuals as a fundamental units of reality. So think of Kant as a standard example of this. Persons are essentially autonomous individuals who control their own destinies through rational decision processes. So we're essentially these like kings, right? Each of us get to declare our choices, why we're going to do what we're going to do, and then we go out and do it, right? Well, that is not really who we are, the deep ecologist is going to say. Actually, whereas on the classical view, individuals are seen as sort of the basic thing and everything else grows out of that, deep ecology turns things on its head and says, not only are relationships more important, our interconnectedness, but that is who we are. What it is to be a human is to play a certain role in this overarching whole, to be a certain point, like a certain intersection of strings in a sweater, right? That's what we are. And if you pull on any other string, any other piece of yarn in the sweater, you're gonna feel that tug wherever you are in the sweater because everything is connected. And so it's not as if we're these like faraway autonomous individuals who stood up and said, you know what, it'd be best for us to work together, so let's come together and make some laws to govern ourselves by. It's quite the opposite, that we start out interconnected. We all start out dependent on adults to care for us, or at least older people to care for us and to feed us and make sure we survive in the beginning when we can't even stand up. And it's out of those relationships that we built societies and that we design, that we come to be cognizant of our interconnectedness and wanting to relate to each other because we are inherently related. So we have this quote, "The flower in the meadow is not an isolated individual accidentally growing there. It's not like it just walked there and said, here's a good spot, I'll stay here. Its very constitution is a consequence of millions of years of active affiliation with other species and with the forces of nature. Even now, it transforms sunlight through photosynthesis, attracts insects with its colorful blossom and nectar, and by the way, depends on those to flourish and reproduce and thrive and make more flowers. And it sends its roots deep into the soil where it's affected by microbes that nourish it and water that provide nourishment. Its individuality is a minor aspect of its embeddedness in a complex system of relationships. Indeed, reality is a universal river of energy. Individuals are mere local disturbances in that flow." It's a much different picture of the nature of the universe, the nature of life on Earth. Humans are only valuable. It's not just that we're only valuable in this respect, but what it is to be a person can only be understood within that context, which is the priority, which ought to be sort of the central focus here. So we don't exist in a vacuum and we didn't grow out of nothing. We're actually formed by our relationships. Who we are is a matter of who we're related to and how we're related to the world around us. Okay. That's deep ecology. So the last one I want to talk about, and there's a few headings in the section that I didn't mention, like feminist ethics and eco-justice, and we're going to talk about all that as the course progresses. And we're going to talk about most of these theories. We're going to look at writing within each of these different genres or different theoretical perspectives, not genres. But we're going to look at more deeply at each of these ideas. So this is really just an introduction. And again, I've moved really quickly through all this, relatively, even though it's a long lecture, but I encourage you to go back and reread the parts that are not clear and ask questions if you have them. I love getting emails especially from my online students, because I won't even really know who you are otherwise. And so please watch this as many times as you need to, go back to certain parts and replay, but don't stop here. So keep learning, and we're going to keep learning in the class, but keep asking questions. Okay, so pragmatic environmental ethics The key to practical environmental ethics is not insisting on ideological conformity to abstract principles, but agreeing as much as possible about our values or goals, and then devising a set of diverse principles that speaks to the issue at hand. Okay, so far we've been looking at moral theory. So I started this lecture with a slide of applied moral questions, and I said that what moral theorists are trying to understand is not the answers to those individual questions, but the theory behind them, the theory that says, how do we find the answers to these questions? Like, what should we be looking for in order to be able to answer these questions? And the pragmatist is saying, don't start with the theory and then try to figure out the answers to the questions based on that theory. Instead, do it the other way around, right? We take the most pressing issues at hand, like how are we going to survive? How are we going to deal with 10-degree hotter summers in 50 years, right? In 50 years is supposed to be 10 degrees hotter at least. So how are we going to deal with that? Or how are we going to mitigate that, right? How are we going to make it not 20 degrees hotter in 100 years, right? How are we going to be able to breathe, be able to make sure our children can breathe, right? How are we going to take these basic issues that we all agree about the goals of, right? We agree that we want to be able to breathe and that we want to be able to drink clean water. We all agree about that. So how are we going to take those goals that we already have, those practical, tangible, hands-on goals, and solve those problems, and then use our solutions and the things that we care about to try to articulate those more abstract theories that affirm the goals that we already have about the practical issues. Okay, so in a way, pragmatic environmental ethics is saying everything we've been doing so far is sort of wrong-headed. It's the wrong way to think about ethics and the wrong way to think about making our lives better and living together and making good choices, which is what I said ethics was about from the beginning. Okay, so for instance, people can come together from different theoretical perspectives to try to save a wetland, to see why saving the wetland is important, agree that it is important, and they might have different reasons for wanting to save it, right? Utilitarians, Kantians, biocentrists, and ecocentrists are all going to have different reasons for why the wetland is important, why saving the wetland is important. But they can agree that it's important and then develop a practical approach together. So ethics is really not about thinking about these abstract principles, but it's trying to make life better. And so if we keep our focus on that, on moving forward in a practical way together, then the theory is not so important, and the theory will come after that. It can emerge from there. It can emerge from those practical goals that we pursue together. Okay, so again, to review, I've gone through an introduction to what morality is. I've talked about utilitarianism, the idea that we ought to maximize happiness or maximize the good. Deontology, the idea that some actions are always right or wrong no matter what their consequences or how much good they bring about, no matter what their consequences are. Then I talked about two attempts to extend those two views. For Singer, the extension moved towards sentient life that's not human, sentient creatures. And for deontology, the extension from Regan moved from thinking about rational subjects to subjects of a life more broadly. Then we talked about Taylor, a biocentrist who wanted to extend that to include any teleological center of a life, anything that's capable of having a good in the first place, having a good of its own. And then we talked about ecocentrism and deep ecology, which really focus on the system as a whole, a more holistic perspective that sees individuals only important insofar as they are part of that larger whole and not really important for their own sake. And then finally we talked about pragmatism, which says stop with all this theory and let's solve our problems and figure out what kind of solutions can work and where we need to make changes in our government and how we govern ourselves and how we live our individual lives and how we participate in society so that we can actually make progress on the things that are plaguing us right now, the things that are going to bring us all down, and then develop some theories out of that. So that was a lot. Again, ask questions if you have them, and have a great day. And don't forget to take some deep breaths in the atmosphere, which still keeps us alive.